Let's now take a look at the grouping attributes that allow us to group our tests. The first one is the owner attribute. So this is a grouping attribute. It specifies who wrote the test, and depending on the framework you're using, the source control system that you're using, it could actually be used to notify the person if the test fails. So this is nice to be able to assign some sort of person to a unit test so that they're required to fix that up and they'll get a notification. Another grouping attribute is priority. Now this is an arbitrary value that you assign, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever priority you want to assign. Does a couple of things. It does allow you to group things, but you can also use this as a filter. When you're using the command line utility, you can actually specify, I only want to run those tests that match this priority. And we're going to take a look at the command line utility later in this course. Another grouping attribute here is test category. Once again, an arbitrary value that you assign, and just like priority, you can also filter using the command line utility. Let's take a look at these grouping attributes: owner, priority, and test category. All right, once again, open up your file process test, find your file name does exist test, and add an owner attribute where inside of that you put some sort of name, right? I'm doing Paul S for Paul Sheriff. And then you can just assign the owner to all these different tests. Maybe I'm going to change this one, and I'll change these to my buddy Steve and say, okay, Steve, you're now assigned to those two. Now, what does this do? Well, now in the test, when we run all tests, when the Test Explorer window comes up, one of the things you can do is group by. And there's lots of different ways you can group them, but one of them is traits. So if you then click on that and move off of it, look what happens. It's now grouping them by the owner. Well, what about the other ones that I mentioned, these other grouping ones like priority? Well, let's take a look. So we can do priority, and I could assign a priority of 1, maybe to the file name does exist, maybe a priority of 2 to this one, a priority of 3, maybe to the last 2. So that way, like I said, we can now group these. So if we run the tests again, we can see them now grouped over here by priority. And as I mentioned, if you're using the command line utility, you can also specify what tests match a certain priority, and those would then be the ones that get run. Another option here is test category. So test category, again, some arbitrary thing. You can say no exception for maybe these two. And then for the last two, you can set the category to be exception. So we're grouping these by whether or not the tests generate an exception or not. And once again, run all tests. And once again, let's go ahead and collapse all. Now we can see that it's being grouped now by exception, no exception, by owner, and by priority.